Hi there, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on changing masculinities and challenging norms. My name's Dr. Stephen Burrell, and I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people here in Australia. And as always, I'm here with Sandy Rexton, who's over in Oxford in the UK. How are you doing, Sandy?
Hi, Stephen. I'm okay. After our recent episode on men's health with Brendan Goff, I did actually come out in a bit of a rash, which is not his fault, but probably more likely a high level of stress accompanied by trying to move house, plus existential angst about the state of the world and the breakdown of the international order. But apart from that, I'm okay. How are you, Stephen?
Yes, it's quite a worrying time for lots of reasons, isn't it? And also a busy time. I've actually had some minor surgery myself, linked to the Crohn's disease, which I also mentioned in the episode with Brendan. So we're certainly shining a spotlight on men's health issues at the moment. So it has taken us a bit longer than normal to produce episodes of the podcast, but we'll keep doing that as regularly as we can. And we're very grateful to you all for the support and positive feedback we get. So please do contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you ever have any questions or comments you'd like to discuss on the podcast. But yeah, as you say, Sandy, it's impossible to ignore the terrible violence which we're witnessing kind of in many parts of the world at the moment, not least in the Middle East. So it seemed like a really important time to invite onto the podcast Dean Peacock, who's a renowned anti-violence activist and advocate, and who's been working in peace building for several decades now.
Yes, Dean and I met over 20 years ago, we realise. At first virtually, when you kindly authored a chapter for an Oxfam book I edited called Gender Equality in Men, Dean. And then in person at the Commission on the Status of Women in their meeting in New York in 2004. So that was around the time that the Global Men Engage Alliance was set up, which Dean and I both played a role in. Dean was the co-chair of Men Engage from 2009 to 2015. And he also co-founded Sonke Gender Justice, a leading South African NGO working across Africa to promote gender transformation, human rights and social justice. Currently, Dean's working with the Global Coalition for WHO Action on Firearm Violence. And until recently, he was a consultant to the UN Family Planning Agency and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So hi, Dean. It's such a joy to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. And Sandy, really, really great to reconnect. I remember, as we talked about earlier, that long walk at CSW when we thought about the establishment of Men Engage and the need for a broad international coalition of feminist organizations working with men. And so amazing to be talking, 22 years later, in the wake of all that has happened in this broad movement that we've been a part of. And as you say, to be talking about it at a time when it is more urgent than ever. The conflicts that you mentioned, Stephen, and then, of course, what feels like relentless news about sexual predation by men, the CNN Rape Academy, of course, the ongoing Epstein story, and the astonishing bravery of Giselle Pellico in bringing to light, these forms of violence which feel new, partly because they're facilitated by new technology. But bottom line, the landscape, I think, reminds us of the urgency of this work. So very, very glad to be chatting with you. And like you, Stephen, also joining from what are unceded lands, although we don't talk about it very much in the context of South Africa, that where I sit at the moment in Cape Town is, of course, originally indigenous land, various groups of Khoisan people, and that history isn't told very much, partly because it's a complicated story, right? But colonial narratives about South Africa essentially continue to be, it was a largely empty land, and we as in settlers arrived at the same time as Black South Africans were coming from further north, which is, of course, not true. It was an occupied land, just as Australia was. And so really important, I think, to ground our discussion in the realities of the places in which we're based, and the importance for a decolonial understanding of that, including what it means for our work in very real ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just to begin with, Sandy mentioned that you've been doing some work with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or WILP, which is the longest standing women's peacebuilding organisation in the world. And so this has involved coordinating a multi-country initiative about mobilising men for feminist peace, which has included the development of a fantastic podcast series, which I would very much recommend our listeners to check out. But at this moment in time, of course, feminist peace does feel quite a long way away in many settings around the globe. So I guess how would you make sense, Dean, of this kind of surge that we're seeing in war and militarism? Like, why do you think this is happening? And I guess, is it making you more concerned at this point in time, perhaps compared to other stages in your career?
Yeah, I mean, without a doubt, I feel more concerned about the state of the world, the kind of escalating conflict. We sit at a particular moment where we don't know whether there is even a ceasefire in Iran. Certainly the ceasefires that have been claimed in Gaza have been routinely violated, and the brazen illegal attacks continue unabated by the Israeli Defense Force, of course, aided and abetted by the US. So we do live in a time of what feels like very dangerous conflict. The threat of nuclear weapons being used. There's all this language about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, even though we know these so-called tactical nuclear weapons are far more destructive than the ones that were dropped on Japan. So I think when we had that walk, Sandy, in New York all those years ago, it was rather unimaginable to us that there would be the level of conflict that there is globally across, parts of Europe, the Sahel, the Middle East. There are conflicts that we barely talk about, which are really dangerous conflicts in Sudan, as one of a number across the Sahel. So how do we understand that level of conflict? And I think, this is a moment to complicate the narrative, because I think in the work that we've all been doing, and it's interesting, Sandy, to reflect back on the title of your book, Men and Gender Equality. It wasn't Men, Masculinities and Transforming Masculine Norms. It was very much focused on men's work to address gender equality. And I think we have to understand that men's violence, whether in intimate partner relationships, in local communities and gangs and other forms of city-based, often violence or international conflict, is driven by a multiplicity of factors. And gender norms, particularly patriarchal norms, are certainly one of those. And we see that all the time, right, with the posturing of people like Trump and, until recently, Orban, certainly Netanyahu, Putin, the list is long. And so, undeniably, conflict is exacerbated by patriarchal norms that valorize all the things we've often talked about, right? Power, domination, aggression. But I think we also have to keep track of the other factors that are at play, the economic issues, which drive a lot of the conflict, the strength of the arms industry and its influence on national policy, and war and conflict. The arms industry has seldom had it as good as they have at the moment. There is concern about whether there are enough arms, when for so long our conversation has been about disarmament and decreasing nuclear stockpiles. We're in a moment where, across Europe, countries are rushing to divert their resources to arms development. And so I think we have to recognize the range of different economic interests that are also driving this conflict. And resource extraction is a big part of this, of course. And the multipolar world that we're in, I think, means that countries are vying for influence in ways that certainly the US didn't feel as obliged to do previously. So I think there is a big, as I say, sort of multifaceted analysis that we have to bring to bear here, and that masculinities, ideas about what constitutes manhood are important. They're necessary, but insufficient to understand the bigger picture of conflict. All of these things come together in a way that perhaps is useful to think about in the context of intersectionality, although that's usually applied at an interpersonal level more than a structural level to understand, interstate conflict. And that's a lot of what we saw in the work with WILF. So it was a 16-country project, mostly conflict and post-conflict countries, mostly in Africa, but also Latin America, the Middle East, Central Asia, little bit in Southeast Asia as well. And there what we saw was, long-standing women's rights activists, peace activists in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Afghanistan, in Cameroon, saying, we have to understand this in the long arc of history. How has colonialism shaped access to resources, to economic opportunity? How does our current world configuration of power mean that military aid, foreign aid gets given to autocratic rulers who are deeply involved in multiple forms of corruption and are providing, access to vital resources? I worked a lot on that project with a Cameroonian researcher, Lotsmart Fonjong, and he's written a lot about women's resistance to land dispossession and what that means for conflict, where men are in supporting women's resistance to land dispossession, and how we understand that in relationship to resources. In the case of Cameroon, oil, timber, palm oil, and the ways in which those industries have really driven conflict.
Well, and I guess these factors very much overlap, don't they? So, like, for example, the arms industry is a very patriarchal, masculinized industry. So I guess a concept which has come up previously on the podcast is the idea of militarized masculinities.
That's right.
Yeah, would you be willing just to say about how you understand that concept and perhaps how you would say that's playing out, for example, at the moment in terms of the actions of the Trump and Netanyahu governments towards Lebanon, Iran, Gaza.
Yeah, so I think, if we analyze that term and think about how it gets applied, it's about the values associated with military might, with resources being primarily oriented towards the military, the armed apparatus of the state, the military, the police, border control, and a devaluing of care in all its forms, right? Whether that's healthcare, the care that's provided in families, education, social security. So it's a diversion of resources in very particular ways to support armed conflict, armed belligerence, and away from all of the things that we know sustain peace. But it's also, of course, supported by forced conscription, and I think conscription takes a number of forms, forced in many countries, mandatory, but also in places like the US. If you're a poor and working class person, the military is one of the few ways you have access to healthcare, to education, to a decent job. So it's the structuring of societies in ways that supports that level of militarization, and one that inevitably ends up reinforcing these hierarchies related to gender. And we see it in particularly pronounced ways at the moment with Pete Hegseth in the US, his relentless attacks on wokeism, by which he means anything other than militarized masculinities, right? So attacks on women, on LGBTQI communities within the military, and more broadly, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all those are out the window in a place where militarized masculinities have become the hegemonic forms of manhood. And if I think about my own childhood, I grew up here in South Africa in a very militarized country. It was kind of a soft militarism in a way for those of us who were beneficiaries of apartheid. But every Friday, I had to go to work dressed in school, dressed in military gear. And we would spend Friday afternoons marching around a field, learning how to be apartheid infantry men, because, of course, conscription into the white South African army was all men. And that was part of a process of indoctrination, which included all the usual misogyny, homophobia, etc., to socialize us into being willing to use violence. And in that case, racist violence. In societies that are militarized, that's often a very common feature. And we saw, Pete Muller, fantastic photographer who I worked with, has documented that process in Ukraine of all of the training that happened to young men, particularly post 2014 and the Russian invasion into Crimea. But, this kind of building of a masculinized military or paramilitary to advance particular aims.
So it's funny to hear you talk then, Dean, about your getting in your military gear on Fridays. I was actually doing the same on Wednesdays in the UK. We have a long history of this as well, probably going back to the Russian Revolution and fears about communism, and I always reflect that I learned how to kill people at school, which seems a rather unlikely scenario, really, but that's how it was. We were firing Second World War rifles on rifle ranges and so on. So it's very universal, this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's still there. Cadet forces, as we would call them, are still part of the experience for many boys and young men in British schools. But I wanted to ask you a bit more about the sort of drivers of men's involvement in armed conflict, because you've had quite a bit to say about that in the past. And I think you've mentioned conflicts in Africa in what you said to us just a minute ago, but it also applies elsewhere, doesn't it?
No, for sure. And I hadn't imagined that in the UK, in what I'm assuming were the 80s, that young men
70s, Dean.
70s and 80s surely were times where there was military training at schools. That's remarkable. And I was essentially challenged to a debate/duel at dawn by one of the arms industry folks here in South Africa, and I was reminded that he was essentially alleging that I had no prior experience with guns. And I thought, I wish that were the case, but I too was trained to kill people, on a shooting range in the suburb in which my school was located. And so it is crazy to think about that socialization and how many of us have had it, right? And there's an interesting and funny way in which the world of men, masculinities, and violence prevention hasn't engaged very much with militarism and conflict, right? We've mostly been quite focused on more intimate forms of violence. But to your question of drivers, it was so interesting. At WILF, where I'm not currently working because, like so many other projects of its nature, we lost funding at the beginning of the Trump administration. We had been funded by Global Affairs Canada, but they then had to move some of their funding to fill the huge holes in humanitarian assistance left by the decimation of USAID. But we grappled a lot with this question, right? Of like, what are we talking about when we talk about militarized masculinities, and what is it in fact that drives men's involvement in armed conflict, not just in militaries. We've talked about militaries for many men, including in some of the countries we worked in. That's not a choice. They have to become involved or not. They're conscripted. And in Colombia, we learned that, even in places where the law has been changed to restrict some of the recruitment and conscription practices, they continue in Colombia to abduct young men off the street and force them into the military, despite the amazing work that a Colombian collective called ACUC is doing, Colombian Organization Against Conscription, is more or less what the acronym is. But we thought a lot about, well, what drives men into non-state armed groups? And there was a way in which there was a sort of default assumption that the primary driver was notions of manhood and masculinities. And right, so in some ways, what we did at WILPF, and I think in many organizations doing peace-building work that had a focus on men and masculinities, was to map onto the work of conflict and post-conflict peace-building models that came from the world of gender-based violence. And so there was little attention to some of the other factors. And so if you look at the international literature, and embarrassingly, I have to say, it took me a year or two into the project before I began to really grapple with what the literature says about the drivers of men's involvement in armed conflict. And norms around masculinities, certainly one of them, but there were a lot of other things going on. Experiencing repression at the hands of the state, so military police repression. The other was corruption, so the sense that the government was engaging in illicit activities to enrich themselves, and that corruption had particular effects on discrete populations, right? So it was sort of targeted at enriching a particular population over others. So those were really important. Generalized inequality and poverty as well. It was really interesting to then go into meetings with organizations doing peace-building work that were interested in masculinities and say, well, hold on a sec. It's not just this desire amongst men to have power and control over others, to be dominant. It's not just male socialization. And in fact, for many men, there's tremendous risk involved in joining armed groups, right? So the vast majority of men in the places we were working in, were doing everything they could to resist being in armed groups. And very often we're actually not getting the kind of support and assistance to stay out of armed groups that we might have hoped for. So we worked with a fantastic researcher, Delphine Brun, who looked at the humanitarian response in Cameroon, and she really identified and explored the ways in which men, because of this implicit blaming of men that sometimes happens through our masculinities analysis, were not getting any of the psychosocial support they needed, despite having experienced sexual violence in conflict, despite having been displaced and being on the run. And so I do think the conversation around the drivers of men's involvement in armed conflict has to be complicated. And the work we did in Colombia, a lot of attention was paid to the role of US military aid. So how does US military aid support precisely the sorts of practices that we know increase men's involvement in armed groups, right? So funding a repressive autocratic government that does exactly the kind of repression with its military and its police that drive men into armed conflict. And so that project, we did a lot of work to try and broaden our frame of analysis and to understand these more complex drivers. There's a fabulous piece of work that we drew on to understand some of the conflict in the Sahel. How have colonial boundaries contributed to violence How does extractivism, in the form often of paramilitary groups in cahoots with industry, taking land away from people in order to extract resources, and through that process, guaranteeing the proliferation of arms into those communities. And of course, engendering resistance to the loss of people's lands. So it's a messy analysis that we really have to embrace, I think, and to say, yes, gender is a part of it, but it's imbricated with all of these other things, which I think, theorists have been saying for a long time. Our work, it seems to me, is to recognize some of those other forces and attempt to address them, restrict the harm that they do in the world, and the pressures that they put on men to engage in militarized behavior. So that was our experience in that project, and we saw that in every country. And it was so interesting. We started working with our WILP sections, as they're called. These are WILP country chapters. And there was a pretty deep-seated assumption that, men embrace war. And people like Delphine and others said, but hang on a second, if we look at what's happening in your country, in fact, we see the vast majority of men, as I said earlier, are doing everything they could to resist being involved in war because they cared about their own lives, they cared about the lives of their families, their communities. And so, I find a lot of solace in recognizing the resistance to violence that we see play itself out among so many men. It opens up all sorts of additional possibilities, I think, when we recognize that most men are not embracing violence, they're resisting it, at least in terms of conflict.
Yeah. I mean, given the huge range of factors you've laid out, the structural factors, and the difficulty of tackling all of those, I'm just wondering where that leaves working with men.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of work goes on at more individual level, group work, individual psychotherapeutic work, whatever, which comes under perhaps the label that you would use, transforming masculinities. But how does that sit, given the huge range of factors you're suggesting need to be addressed?
Yeah. No, it's a very important and in some ways vexing question, right? Like, how do you do work that effectively addresses the multiple forms of violence men engage in intimate partner relations, in conflict, in gangs? Can you do that work in ways that doesn't necessarily foreground masculinities? I think you can. And I'll give you a very local example of work that we did at Sonke Gender Justice, which was really illuminating for us as an organization. So we were part of the UK government-funded What Works to End Violence Against Women initiative, and we implemented a project in a large informal settlement, sort of very poor community on the outskirts of Johannesburg called Diepsloot. We interviewed 2,500 men about their life experiences and about their endorsement of and investment in particular ideas of manhood and masculinities. And I was working with two researchers at the time at the University of Witwatersrand who really pushed us to include questions I would never have included. I would have focused very much on the usual masculinities indicators, the gender equitable male scale, men's endorsement of a particular set of norms. And they said, yeah, we're going to include those, but we also want to understand men's experiences of hunger, men's experiences of trauma, men's experiences of unemployment, household, the built environment, alcohol outlet density, questions that we at Sonke were really not dealing with, and that in some ways we saw as a distraction. And when we analyzed the data, what was so interesting was yes, of course, the men who endorsed ideas about control, entitlement to women's bodies, dominance, those men did use violence more than those who didn't. But they were about twice as likely. But the men who had experienced trauma in two forms, violence against themselves as children and witnessing violence against their mothers, were 5 times more likely to use violence. Men who had problematic drinking histories were 2.5 times more likely to be violent. Men who experienced chronic food scarcity, who had sustained issues with hunger, also very likely to use violence. Now, those are overlapping categories, of course, but what that pushed us to do is to say, okay, well, what do we do about alcohol outlet density? Is the government, the local government in that place, paying attention to alcohol regulations? No, they weren't. That's a national problem in South Africa. We have a, broadly speaking, unregulated alcohol environment. In some of the poorer communities in South Africa, you'll find multiple unlicensed outlets in the same block. They're open all hours, and there's little attempt to ensure any kind of safety in those places. And in fact, research shows that from those places, you can kind of identify a straight red line of increased violence of all sorts. So we began to really pay attention to alcohol as an accelerant, enabler. And that debate, Stephen, I know, has just happened quite fiercely in Australia, related to Michael Salter and Jess Hill's work, pushing for stronger inclusion of alcohol and other commercial determinants of violence in Australia's National Action Plan to address violence against women. So I think, Sandy, in answer to your question, if our goal is to decrease men's use of violence, we have to bring a multifactorial analysis. We have to understand that it's complicated to try and change ideas about manhood and masculinities, and to go into a community like Diepsloot and exhort the most socially excluded men, unemployed, migrant, experiencing xenophobia, chronic food insecurity, no recreational outlets, no green space, living in an environment that repeatedly says to them and everyone in that community, you are unimportant, you are relatively inconsequential. To expect those men to buy into an intervention that says the problem here is ideas of manhood and we're going to shift those, and that very often situates those new norms as being Western derived, even though they're not. It's a really hard ask. And I'll just give you one other example where this came up. So right after October 7, when the Hamas attack occurred, I was on a panel, a side event at the UN, and I said, well, we're talking about Palestine and talking about engaging men. And I said, it feels like a really hard ask at the moment to say to Palestinian men, the problem here is your ideas and kind of embodiment of manhood and masculinities. And we want to change that. And I was so reminded of an amazing young man who came to a meeting we convened in Tbilisi from Palestine. And he said, it's just so hard for me to do masculinities work in occupied Palestinian territories when the cause of the violence is so clear. It's colonialism, it's the Nakba, it's the Israeli Defense Force. And he said, this work will be so much more successful if we're seen to be challenging multiple forms of violence and not just focusing on the most socially excluded, and in fact, drawing attention to the relations of power that drive genocidal violence and interpersonal violence, right? And so I think we have to do all of that. And it is daunting. It means thinking about how we provide psychosocial support at scale. It means thinking about workforce development among social workers, auxiliary social workers, It requires doing things that happened in the HIV response, actually. We didn't have enough people to do HIV testing, so we did task shifting. We made sure that community members got the basic skills needed to do HIV testing, and then nurses and others could move on and do other things. And there are lots of models of effective peer-based psychosocial support to address trauma. Similarly, there is no shortage of evidence about what works to decrease alcohol-related violence. And it's not the stuff that is about exhorting people to drink less. It's about changing the broader alcohol environment. It's about restricting access. It's about closing places earlier, decreasing alcohol content in beverages. It's banning alcohol advertising. So in many countries, it's also thinking about, well, and this is something I'm thinking about a lot at the moment, gun violence and access to guns and its intersection with masculinities, right? We, in the literature and in the work on men and guns and firearm violence, there's kind of a default assumption that somehow or another men are invested in gun ownership and gun use. But we often don't think about the decades of work that the arms industry and the gun industry has done to create weapons as kind of totems of masculinities, right? And the National Rifle Association, the Pentagon has worked super closely with film, television, video games to make sure that men and gun ownership have become, utterly intertwined. So we have to challenge that marketing. That's clear. And there are places where that's happening and places where it's not happening at all. We have to make sure that, we recognize the commercial determinants of violence. I think we neglect that at our peril.
Yeah, I mean, we wanted to ask you about that because you are a commissioner on the Lancet Commission on Gun Violence and Health, and also a co-leader of the newly launched Global Coalition for WHO Action on Firearm Violence. Do you want to tell us a bit more about the work you're doing there? Like, why is it that you are focusing on the World Health Organization, for example? And any more you want to say about those specific links in terms of masculinity and the firearms industry? Yeah.
No, sure. Thank you. It's fascinating work, and it's all at the moment a labor of love. We have a secretariat of 5 people, all of whom are volunteering their time. And in some ways, it's quite nice to be sort of back in unpaid activism without any of the strings that come attached to more professionalized work. This is linked to a meeting I co-convened at WILPF in 2024 in Geneva. We brought 40 people from around the world together to have a conversation about the marketing of weapons and war and the gender exploitative ways in which that happens. Now, a lot of the marketing is directed at men, but a growing amount of it is also directed at women, either to encourage gun ownership as a form of empowerment for women, or using women's bodies to market guns to men. And so we looked at kind of a broad set of forces that are normalizing the marketing of weapons and war. Most people don't know it, and it sounds slightly conspiratorial to say it, but it is nonetheless true that the Pentagon has been collaborating in a formal, organized way with Hollywood since the beginning of the film industry. And so for the big blockbuster films like Top Gun, classic example, or really any of the films that include military equipment, the Pentagon says, fine, we'll provide you with that equipment, but in return, we will line edit your script. Now, there is an archive at Georgetown University where all of the scripts were located. And initially, people like Roger Stahl, who's done a lot of writing on this, Tana Mirlis, thought that, it was a few dozen films, thousands of films, and they were able to see the scripts where, the redlining happened. And so it's both kind of what ideas about militaries, conflict, the enemy, men as protectors are put out into the world, and what stories are never put out into the world because they don't get the funding. So we were looking at those dynamics, also the placement of guns and military equipment in video games played by billions of people around the world now. I think it's 3.5 billion people play video games. And many of the blockbuster video games were developed by the US Department of Defense, the UK Department of Defense, as recruitment tools and as, kind of practice tools. So point is, the media landscape is inundated with marketing, tactics and strategies of the gun industry, militaries, in ways that link manhood to war and conflict and weapons, and normalize the use of weapons. So that was a fabulous meeting. And out of that, people sort of on the last day really began to ask these questions about, well, who's regulating the marketing? And we all said, well, the WHO, they're up the hill from us. Surely they have done similar work to limit the harm of marketing as a health issue in the way that they have around alcohol or tobacco, or baby formula or pesticides. And so we expected that we would find a robust body of work around the restriction of harmful marketing. And we began to dig. We looked initially at their violence prevention documents and we couldn't find anything. We then analyzed all 3,500 of the World Health Assembly resolutions passed since 1948. Not a single one includes the words firearms or guns. Not one. By comparison, and this is not to suggest this is an unimportant issue, it isn't, baby formula regulation has about 20 resolutions. But gun violence, which kills 450,000 people a year worldwide, not a single mention. Why? Because of the political economy shaping how WHO functions, right? So the US repeatedly blocked it, and heard on a phone call with someone quite senior recently that any time their team attempted to address gun violence onto the WHO agenda, they would get a call from the US saying, it's not your mandate, don't do it. We will reduce or withdraw our funding. So what we discovered, bottom line, is that the WHO has done very little on gun violence in the last 15 years, despite doing great work in other areas. The INSPIRE framework to address violence against children, the RESPECT framework to address violence against women have been rolled out all over the world. And that happens a lot with the WHO, right? They provide guidance to member states, to departments of health, women's ministries, and their frameworks get used. But the RESPECT framework, the INSPIRE framework barely mention gun violence at all, even though gun violence is increasingly the leading instrument used in femicide and the main driver of mortality amongst children in Mexico, Brazil, the US, South Africa. That's true. And yet the INSPIRE framework barely mentions it. RESPECT framework, femicide is the leading cause of death. Well, gun-related femicide, same issue, right? Guns are neglected in our discussions about domestic violence, both in terms of femicide and in terms of what the presence of a gun means in the context of an abusive relationship. If I know my partner has a weapon, and all the more so if they threaten me with it, what that means for my ability to leave, what it means for the kind of trauma I and my kids experience, it completely changes the nature of coercive control when fatality is a very likely outcome in the presence of a gun in the home. So I think we've neglected that at our peril. And interestingly, when it comes to men's health, WHO has done little generally, but very little on this question of gun violence and men's health, despite the fact that men, as I'm sure you know, constitute nearly 90% of gunshot victims, fatalities, that is. That has major implications for suicide prevention. The majority of gun deaths in the US are suicides, and men are vastly overly represented in those data. So we are making progress. It's a difficult time because the WHO is very stretched for resources in the wake of the shift that we were talking about earlier to, amongst many member states, to fund their militaries rather than, respect their commitments to global health governance, because they all are supposed to pay the WHO money, and many are in arrears terribly. So it links us back to the conversation around militarism.
Thanks, Dean. I could listen to you for hours talking, but I realise that we've almost come to
talking for hours.
The end of our time. But before we finish, I wanted to ask you more about the sort of personal side of the work, and your personal journey, if you like, through this work. I mean, as I understand it, you first got involved in activism for peace and equality through campaigning against apartheid in South Africa, and 1985, sometime around then. But why do you think you started engaging with feminism and anti-violence work in the first place? What was it that motivated you?
I was fortunate in some ways. I ended up going to a very activist university at UC Berkeley, and my partner at the time, who was Nicaraguan, was volunteering at a battered women's shelter in San Francisco, Casa de las Madres. And we had both been involved in lots of different activism against the Gulf War, against US intervention in Central America. I had always had this question, though, of what's my place in this work as a white South African living in the US as a man? So she came home one day after having attended a training by the then director of Men Overcoming Violence in San Francisco. And she said, here's the answer to your question of what you should be doing that isn't about doing work in solidarity with, but is actually in very real ways about working with, yourself, your own issues, and other men. And she said, go volunteer at Men Overcoming Violence. And, I placed a call to them, didn't hear back for months. They were small, like so many initiatives. But then I was invited in for an interview, and I remember Jim Myers, a lovely guy, saying, well, why are you here? And I said, well, I would like to learn some skills that I can take back to South Africa. It was always my dream to go back to South Africa. And so I was invited to observe groups, to initially do phone interviews with people who wanted to come in, and then ultimately ended up running groups for adult men who had been mandated by the courts to attend a batterer intervention program. And it was remarkable work. I was simultaneously working with homeless and runaway youth, many of whom were on the streets because their fathers were some version of the men I was working with. They had had to run away from homes where they experienced violence, or they witnessed their mothers experience violence. And so it felt like a way of doing upstream work to address youth violence or violence perpetrated against youth, and to address youth homelessness. And so, that was motivation. At the same time, in my family, domestic violence and, teen dating violence had manifested itself with my sisters. And so there was also that powerful personal connection. But being in those rooms with men who had come to move, and there were some men who'd come voluntarily, usually mandated by their partners. And, the conversations that were happening around their lives, around male socialization, the pressures that they felt as men, the inability to talk about their feelings, resonated so powerfully for me as a young man. I was at that point, I think, 22, having grown up in very patriarchal, very militarized apartheid South Africa. So I felt like I had free therapy every time I sat around one of those groups. And I was constantly amazed by the insight. I remember one of the men being asked, well, how do you feel about that? And he said, well, I feel like that. And the facilitator stopped him and he said, no, that's a thought. I'm asking about your feeling. And I realized I'd never made that distinction previously. It was like a revelation. And so being involved in those groups as a facilitator allowed me into conversations that were so important for me myself, and that I think also generated real change. And as a result of that, did a lot of work in the jails in San Francisco, worked with youth involved in gang violence, started a peer education program in the San Francisco School District. And, you know, I often left those places just feeling like, wow, how did I get to be so lucky to be doing work that feels so meaningful to me and to the communities in which I was working. So that was, you know, this kind of convergence of needing to understand myself, needing to understand the violence that was putting kids in the streets in San Francisco and Nicaragua, where I also did some work, and feeling a very urgent need to also address the violence that I had learned was affecting people I cared about very deeply in my own family. And so it was kind of that convergence of political, personal, that you know, feminists have been saying is at the core of our work, the personal and the political. So yeah, I've been very lucky. I've got to do that work for the last 30 odd years, and have always found it riveting and meaningful. I've got to have conversations like this, meet people like you both. So yeah, it's been an incredible journey. And I got to come back to South Africa. I came back on holiday the first time after doing some work that was policy work and therefore a little bit better paid. I was a member of the team that wrote the first agenda for the nation on violence against women in the US in the Clinton administration. In 99, 2000. So I came back to South Africa and met with lots of organizations working with men or working on addressing gender-based violence, and wrote a small piece that got published and got picked up by Jackson Katz, who I had met through my work in DC. And he put me in touch with Engender Health. They hired me. I came back to South Africa to coordinate the work of the Men as Partners Network. And you know, working with lots of amazing people here in South Africa, very rooted in our activist and human rights traditions in South Africa. And a group of us said, well, we want more of that activist sensibility, more of that human rights focus in our work. And so we started an organization, Sonke Gender Justice, 20 years ago, that is now working in 25 countries across the continent. So it's been an amazing journey, and our offices for a long time were on the main stretch in Cape Town, Adderley Street, looking out over Parliament, over the Slavery Museum, in fact, and onto Table Mountain. And I often looked out of that window and I was like, how did I get to be so lucky? And so it's been an incredible journey, and I'm now doing more work in academia, which gives me a lot more time to read and to think and to try and make sense of the work, and to write. So it's been, you know, this very powerful journey that I feel very fortunate for.
Yeah. Well, we've been incredibly fortunate to be able to listen to you talking today, Dean. And yeah, I mean, your work has been incredible inspiration to a lot of people as well, I think. So thank you so much for that.
Well, that's very kind of you. And
for talking.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, it's been such a pleasure, Dean. Thank you so much for sharing some of your great work.
Just one thing before we stop, if I may, if I can just. But I know one of your recent guests was Finn McKay.
Yes.
And I think the work that Finn and others, Ray Atchison at WILP, there are a number of people who have been questioning kind of where we go with the masculinities analysis, right? And I think I wanted to just connect with that because it's part of, for me, this broader question of, in as much as our work is very focused on transforming masculinities or analyzing masculinities, what is the vision we have for where that goes, right? And I think people like Finn and others are saying it's a very useful lens onto the problem. It's a very useful framework for analyzing multiple issues related to men's lives, including men's violence. But they have asked this question of, well, what are we ultimately saying then about masculinities? Is our end goal a different kind of masculinities and manhood? Or are we saying that, in fact, we should free ourselves from the strictures of these gender binaries and these, I think, implicitly essentialist understandings of gender that we convey when we talk about the need to transform masculinities, as though the end goal is still a version of masculinities. And I'm not sure that's the case. Nathan Robinson wrote this fabulous piece in, I think it was Current Affairs a while ago, and said, like, well, what qualities would we want men to have that people of other genders don't have? And surely what we should aspire to is people who are compassionate, committed to equality, etc. And that those need not be coded as positive masculinities. They can just be human aspirations. And in that piece, he says, why should young men need a male role model? Why can't Berta Cáceres or any other number of women leaders be someone who we hold up as role models to men, to women, to people of all gender identities? And to me, that's a much more exciting vision than transforming masculinities. I've also, in this discussion, kind of raised my uncertainties about where masculinities and gender norms fit into this broader spectrum of approaches to dealing with men's violence. But I think a lot of my career, especially since we established Men Engage, has been saying, let's bring the structural into our work more. Let's bring a political economy into our work more. One of the main reasons I was interested in an entity like Men Engage was to say, here's a place where we can diffuse some ideas that make our work more overtly political again, and that draw attention to these broader structural inequalities related to colonialism, class inequalities, industrialization, extractivism, all of that. And we haven't talked much about, technology as a part of that, big tech, and the issues that we discussed when we talked about the Rape Academy that CNN has profiled. But I think the conversation has to go there. So for whatever it's worth, that's the piece that I'm struggling with at the moment. Yeah.
No, thanks for raising that, Dean. Because as you say, it's been raised by Finn and actually others on
I'm sure.
our podcasts, and it's something we've returned to, several times, and it feels to me an increasingly powerful, description of the issues, the problem, the direction we should be traveling in. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, Sonny, that was a very riveting conversation with Dean. Felt like it went by very quickly. What thoughts do you have from what he said? I'm sure you must have lots.
It was great to talk to Dean and to see him after such a long time as well. But one thing that occurred to me, which I thought was interesting, amongst many, by the way, was the notion of men resisting involvement in militaries and, combat and so on. And, you don't often hear that said, but actually you need to be reminded of that most men don't want to get involved in this stuff. And I was thinking about my own background, actually, and I said I was, I learned how to kill men at school. But, in year 2 of the cadet force, I went into what was called first aid and light rescue because I didn't really want to be involved in any of the violence stuff. And I thought at the time this is the only part of it that really seems of any use to me at all. So in a minor way, I was actually resisting, at that time.
Yeah.
And I feel some sort of affinity with that approach.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you should say that because I was pondering when you were both talking because I'm very lucky. Obviously, I am a fair bit younger, and I didn't have any kind of military-esque training when I was at school, but I did, and I think this is still a thing now. I wanted to go to Beavers, when I was very young, and people outside of the UK probably won't know what Beavers is, but it's an early stage along the trajectory, I think, of like the kind of the Scouts, which is ultimately quite a militaristic youth organisation, really, isn't it? And almost proto-fascist, maybe some people say.
Proto-fascist. You should have gone to the Woodcraft Club.
Well, I did that.
Lefty Scouts.
Lefty Scouts. Well, that's it. That's the next step in the story because I only lasted about 2 weeks in the Beavers before I dropped out. And I think after that, my mum was actually involved in organising our local woodcraft folk group, so I was very involved in that. But also at school, I didn't enjoy doing PE or physical education and sport. So when I actually had the choice, I immediately chose to do first aid, like you, Sandy, instead of choosing to do a sport. So.
Yeah, we're clearly doing the wrong podcast, Stephen.
Unfortunately, I can't remember any of my first aid skills. But I think... But I think you're absolutely right as well that, men have to be kind of pressured and forced and trained to use violence and to kill other people, don't they? And that's actually a big part of militaries, isn't it? Is that there's all that training and brutalization of soldiers to get to the point that they're even willing or able to kill other people. And I think if you look at what's been going on in Russia and Ukraine, for example, lots and lots of men have been desperately trying to avoid fighting, haven't they?
I must just put in a plug for a film called If by Lindsay Anderson, which was partly shot at my school, which is a sort of late 60s take on militarism and that sort of muscular Christianity in the British public school. I think it's an absolutely fantastic film, and it's really got quite a lot to say about the military. Excellent. So worth looking at that if you never have.
Thank you.
But I was... very interested by Dean's argument about the importance of structural factors in violence, both in relation to combat, but also at the sort of interpersonal level. And again, I'm wondering where that leaves practitioners on the ground, many of whom who may listen to a podcast like this. And my understanding from some of that work, particularly on interpersonal violence, is that some programs focus on getting men to take responsibility for what they've done, and not be able to slip away from responsibility by using excuses like, well, I was drunk or I'd taken drugs or
you've had trauma in your life and
you've had trauma in your background. So I think that's quite interesting how you deal with that sort of tension between taking responsibility but acknowledging broader factors. It's something that occurred to me anyway. What do you think, Stephen?
I agree. It's a tension, isn't it? And I think you can do both. But I guess we also need to figure out those complexities of lots of men do experience trauma. They do experience abuse in childhood, but don't go on to perpetrate violence. In fact, they may speak out passionately about that violence, for example. And of course, lots of men who use abuse are middle class or upper class men, who haven't experienced poverty or hunger that Dean was describing, and actually maybe even more skilled in exerting coercive control, in a more subtle, hidden way. So there are those complicating factors, aren't there? But nonetheless, I do think that his points were absolutely right. I mean, like what he was saying about the computer games industry, for example. Like I actually heard on his podcast them talking about how weapons companies have product placement in computer games. So when you're choosing your weapon, that's actually product placement for these companies. So they know, that these computer games, which many people, many boys, for example, are playing, are an opportunity to sell their wares, kind of thing. And that's just one small example, isn't it? So there's a lot a lot that we need to reckon with. And I think actually if we can address those structural and social factors more, I think that actually that's potentially helps us to engage with men, doesn't it? Because then it maybe doesn't come across like we're blaming men for actually what is a systemic societal problem, but actually this is something which is damaging and affecting all of us. And I guess it shows as well, doesn't it, that maybe in the kind of engaging men field, maybe we do need to be doing more of that kind of advocacy and social movement building to push for the kind of systemic change that Dean is talking about. Although I would just say as well that I think for me sometimes, and I'm not saying Dean was doing this, but I think one problem with that argument can be that if we talk about those structural factors as if they're somehow separate from gender or from patriarchy, when actually they themselves are often very gendered and are actually part of the kind of system and structures of patriarchy themselves, aren't they? If we're talking about the alcohol industry or the weapons industry or computer games, tech industry and so on, these are very patriarchal institutions, aren't they?
Yep. And I think his final point about not just transforming masculinities, but thinking about how we need to free everyone from the constraints of rigid gender norms. You know, that's come up on our podcast on several occasions now, and you know, I find it increasingly convincing. You know, and you know, it's a way of thinking about this work which opens up new territory, new possibilities. I guess that it's about the future for all of us. It's not just about, you know, sorting men or sorting masculinities. So yeah, I think this is important.
Absolutely. Perhaps we need a new tagline for the podcast in that case, Andy. We've just come up with one new one.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's probably enough for us for one week. But yes, thank you so much, as always, everybody, for listening. As I mentioned at the beginning, don't be afraid to contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you ever have questions or comments. And take care of yourselves. Do subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. And we shall speak to you again soon.
Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.